Chapter 37. Healing and feeding miracles of the 5,000 people in the desert. After hearing, as previously told, what the newly arrived disciples of John told me, which surely I had already been aware of, or I would not have already at the most appropriate time in the morning dismissed the entire big company, I soon left Nazareth and went with the 12 disciples towards Sibara near the sea, at once entering a ship and travelling to the vicinity above Bethabara. On board, the disciples were telling me what else they were teaching and doing during the day, for which I also praised them. Upon reaching the predetermined place, I commanded the disciples to remain in the ship by themselves, getting to shore by myself, accompanied only by 2 disciples, to the desert in order to seek and determine a spot where I could tarry a few days and be safe from Herod's pestering. But there were other vessels following our ship at a certain distance, and therefore easily finding out my whereabouts. The easier because I had no intention of hiding away completely from needful mankind. Therefore, not a day of my stay in this desert had passed yet before a vast number of people poured in from all cities, markets, and villages, including my old disciples numbering already over 800, who had joined me in the previous cities and markets, and whom I had sent home to their places the previous morning. Matthew chapter 14, verse 13. Some of these were of Cana in Galilee and Cana in Samaria, some of Jessera, some from Kis and Sibara, Capernaum, Chorazim, Caesarea, Gennesaret, and Bethabara, spreading my renown also in many other places, so that a vast throng of people were coming to me partly by sea and partly by walking through the desert, together of course with a large number of all kinds of sick and festering. As said earlier, the day had hardly dawned, when nearly 1,000 pilgrims seeking after me found my encampment settling down around it. My camp that I had chosen in the desert, however, was a spacious cave with no rear exit. The cave was situated fairly high up and densely overgrown with trees. There was also a large open space in front of it, where several thousand people could find ample camping room, and upon this place the people had settled down together with their sick. When my disciples, who were aware of my stay, saw how masses of people streamed up from all sides, surrounding the place where I was staying ever more densely, they became concerned about me. They put their ship in charge of their 8 seamen and made their way up to me to tell me what masses of people were converging on me, and that they could not vouch for Herodians not being among them. After the well-meaning and anxious disciples brought me the news, which I was bound to know anyway, I emerged from the grotto to take a look at the truly huge crowd. And I really commiserated with them when with tearful eyes they were asking me to heal their sick. And I healed all the sick who were present in a moment. Matthew chapter 14, verse 14. As well as all those still making their painstaking way towards me, whereupon there was of course no end of praising and lauding. People were still streaming in towards the evening. Although their sick became well on the way, so that they might bring thanks and praise. The space before the grotto was getting overcrowded until the disciples began to actually take fright, whilst young people climbed trees to get a better view of me. When evening started breaking upon us, the disciples stepped over to me, saying, "Lord, it is desert here and night is befalling us, and as we all noticed, nobody brought edibles with them." Hence let the people go, so they would go to nearby markets to buy themselves bread and food. Matthew chapter 14, verse 15. Said I to the disciples, "It is not necessary that the people go to the markets for that, but just give them to eat." Matthew chapter 14, verse 16. For drinking they don't need more than water, which is found here in rich springs. Say the disciples, somewhat taken aback at my request, "Lord, we have with us only 5 loaves of barley and 2 roasted fishes." Matthew chapter 14, verse 17. What is that for so many people? Say I to the disciples, "Then bring them over to me." Matthew chapter 14, verse 18. When the disciples had done so, I commanded the people to all settle down on the grass, then took the 5 loaves and the 2 fishes, looked towards heaven, and thanked the Father, then breaking the breads and giving them to the disciples, and these gave them to the people. Matthew chapter 14, verse 19. The 2 fishes and a little bread this time, however, was left for the disciples. And all those present ate, and were sufficiently filled. Since they could not eat it all up, they gathered the leftover portions into baskets, which people usually carried on a journey, and these baskets normally were quite large and were carried on their backs by means of shoulder straps. Yet 12 of these were filled with the leftover portions. Matthew chapter 14, verse 20. The number of those who had eaten, not counting the women and children, were nearly 5,000 men. Matthew chapter 14, verse 21. That this feeding, lasting a good hour, aroused great astonishment among these people shall of course be easy to understand, as also the fact that these people decided to at once make me their king. Since I discerned these people's intentions, however, I commanded the disciples to immediately board the ship and sail to the opposite shore ahead of me, pending my dismissal of the people. Matthew chapter 14, verse 22. But this I did to scuttle the people's plan, as men had already begun to discuss these intentions with my disciples, out of exceeding thankfulness. Nobody, however, dared to approach me personally. By the sudden dispatch of the disciples, I took the means out of the people's hands. And after the disciples betook themselves to the ship on a moonlit night in response to my word, the people gradually desisted from their intentions. After the departure of the disciples who had already cast out to sea, I let the people go, and they went away willingly. Thereupon, I climbed a nearby bare mountain and prayed there, in order to unite my human carnal self yet more closely with the Father. Upon this mountain top I then tarried completely by myself, and in the bright moonshine was able, even with the eyes of the flesh, to make out the disciples' ship in the middle of the sea, which was not very wide, struggling heavily with the waves whipped up in their direction by a contrary wind of some vehemence. Matthew chapter 14, verse 24.